That day, after watching videos of traffic accidents shared on social media for a while, he called his siblings over the phone about the idea that had previously occupied his mind. His older sister and younger brother had accepted the idea of coming together, at least for the last time, to visit their older brother in this mortal world without any excuse. They agreed on a place and date to meet. They informed their brothers about their visit in advance, so as not to encounter any surprises. After these meetings were completed, he leaned back in his chair and took a deep breath, as if he had accomplished a great task. This will be a farewell dinner for wise people rather than a council of elders, he thought. Then he let himself go into the flow of his memories, which had a strong nostalgic effect on him. His earliest memories include a camel caravan leaving the city and dirtying the ground opposite the shop at the crossroads, and his father cleaning it with a broom and shovel. The camels, which had been used for centuries in transportation, disappeared from life in those years, never to be seen again, except for festivals. That dirt road was later paved with rough stones, much later asphalted, and years later converted into concrete. Since his childhood, the city had been slowly rising towards the sky, as if imperceptibly, with the municipalities always building the new on top of the old, without digging foundations in their pavement and roadworks. While chasing traces of the old world in cities with prominent historical value, he had noticed this kind of practical transformation, which he had seen in many parts of the country, during his last visit to the city. The restored historical values were located below the streets or avenues where daily life continued, and in some places, these places were visited by going down the stairs. Their house, built in the early 50s, was the highest in the neighborhood, which consisted of single-story houses, mostly with gardens. The terrace of this two-story house, occupying the corner, overlooked a large part of the city. Among his unforgettable memories were watching the entire plain, the mountain rising in front of them, and the countless stars in the sky while lying on the rug he and his brothers had spread on the ground in the city where light pollution was not effective due to the scarcity of nights in those years. On the plain, they would always immediately spot the quote, black train coming from far away, and in the rainy season they would watch in amazement as the river that gave life to the land overflowed, creating huge puddles of water. In these cases, many villages, large and small, were often stranded. Although the historical face of the city, which was completely destroyed by the Great Fire disaster at the end of the War of Independence, began to change towards an ordinary, identityless appearance as seen in other parts of the country, it was accepted that the real transformation occurred with the modernization in the middle of the century. In his childhood, life was still characterized by the old world. He knew this best from his life in the grocery store. It was always interesting to him to see a tanker truck pull up to the shop and fill a barrel of kerosene with its hose, which was raised half a meter off the ground right next to the entrance. He was careful not to get his hands in the liquid as much as possible when he sold measuring cups of kerosene to customers who came with a bottle. They would also keep bottles of rubbing alcohol and gas needles for the pressure stove used in homes. Another use for kerosene was in lamps. For this reason, the wick, the mechanical part, and the lamp glass required for lamps were sold. The sale of oil was the same way. Olive oil and sunflower oil were poured into the customer's container with the help of measuring cups and a funnel. Cologne was also sold with the help of a narrow and long glass measuring cup. This time, rubbing his hands, especially with cologne, had become part of his job. Vita, the yellow-colored oil, was sold by scooping it out of a 20-kilogram can, placing a small amount on a piece of greaseproof paper, and weighing it on a scale. The white-colored Sana, on the other hand, was more easily marketed as it came packaged in wooden boxes. Some argued that the company that produced these oils, which the government had set up in partnership with a foreign firm, was an example in the country's economic history. Foodstuffs such as cheese, olives, and halva, which were widely consumed, were weighed on the scales and offered for sale. The agricultural workers who went to work in the fields in the early hours of the morning would often take a loaf of bread and 100 grams of olives and halva with them for lunch while they worked all day under the sun. Of course, life was not easy for some in every period. In a black and white photograph, Salim Effendi, posing in front of his as-yet finished house, was apparently one of the most flamboyant, if not the richest, man in the neighborhood. This should not be deceiving, because he was certainly a, quote, moral monument who did not allow ostentation. When the old man imagined his father, he thought that this was the most accurate description of him. This man of medium height, thin and always serious appearance, was someone who had fulfilled to the letter what society expected of him in life. Moreover, if we consider that the starting point was full of misfortunes, it could be considered quite successful. The fact that an orphan child came to the country with a wave of migration from the Balkans at the beginning of the 20th century and held on to life required being fair in passing judgment on him. Yet he was not entirely unfortunate. The fact that he was taken in and adopted and then educated in a boarding school worked in his favor, in his struggle for life. Even better, he was given land to cultivate in line with the farmers' land law passed by the government. He seized these opportunities and became a good citizen, a family man and a respected figure in his community. Salim Effendi had an infallible sense of righteousness that could be called strict. He had a strong sense of conscience and a religious understanding that, as having spiritual direction, did not allow any kind of controversy. And this religious feeling became the dominant motivation of his life. After 2 unsuccessful marriages due to reasons such as his wives not being able to give him children, his luck turned around, and with the encouragement of his last wife, he married a girl 20 years younger than him and eventually had 5 children, one of whom died in infancy. A few years later, in order to send his children to school, he sold his house and land in the village and moved to the city, 40 kilometers away. Salim Effendi's literacy made him a distinguished figure in his neighborhood. He bought newspapers, had more than a shelf of religious books in his house, read the Quran constantly, and taught all his children religious knowledge himself. The old man always lamented that he was not literate enough to read his father's diaries, which he had inherited, written in the old language using the Arabic alphabet, because of the language revolution that led to the adoption of the Latin alphabet. As he visualized his father, he wondered, how much did his mindset, where social rules were the weight, allow the expression of his suppressed individual sides? Still, I must not be unfair to him. Even though it was weak, a malevolent side of him that did not care about what others had to say was also making itself felt. Behind his social success lay a self-control mechanism built on anxieties and, more importantly, fears. This mechanism dominated his behavior so strongly that it prevented him from expressing his natural human emotions to his wife and children. But his diaries were an exception, and it was perhaps only in these pages that he was able to escape from the pressure and loneliness he felt deeply. However, the fact that he asked his wife's permission to grow a beard, consulted her every once in a while, and allowed her to take him out with her friends showed that the outwardly rigid monotony of their marriage was not true. It could certainly be thought that the modern lifestyle of the sweetheart who had mediated in his marriage had an effect on this. However, his liberal attitude was remarkable in his conservative environment. In addition, he must have been pleased that his wife earned a little money from tailoring. Salim Effendi's spiritual structure, although completely filled with the religious duties that regulated his life, had the crushing weight of loneliness. This feeling had such a negative effect that it reminded people of their limitations and their helplessness in the face of problems they were helpless in solving. His father had experienced this feeling most clearly when he could not find guarantors for his eldest son to get a loan for his higher education. None of the merchants from whom he constantly bought goods for his shop would vouch for him. But he would feel this helplessness even more acutely in his experience with his eldest son, whom he had once given up for adoption shortly before his death. The household refrigerator, in which the small shop kept its foodstuffs, had been bought by his eldest son, who had become a wage earner. And the son came one day, emptied the fridge, and took it away. Then, naturally, the yogurt turned sour, and the cheese spoiled because of the heat. The old man thought it would be fair to give him a share in this part of his memories. In the city, one of the ways people had fun on holiday nights was to set off fireworks and explosives that made noise. These materials were sold everywhere, and that year the governor's office had specifically banned the sale of one of them. The old man, who was a student at the time, was caught red-handed while selling the prohibited product on the stall he had set up in front of the shop when the police used a common criminal. He remembered the common criminal from the theft he had committed from his shops a while ago. There was something disturbing and wrong about the police's use of a method of catching a criminal by using another criminal. In the end, his father, the shop owner, was held accountable for this. He was called to the police station, and his statement was taken. He never forgot that moment in his life when he saw his father sitting on a wooden chair and giving his statement to the officer in front of him. After that incident, whenever the old man spoke to a police officer, he worried that he would be found guilty. He had caused his father to suffer the punishment for his own mistake. Salim Effendi, who had always obeyed the law to the letter throughout his life with his strong sense of conscience, was found guilty of an act in which he had no involvement, as if it were a simple example of the injustice of the world. He was mentally exhausted and eventually retired, quitting his job. He rented the shop and its contents to someone he knew well in the neighborhood. Just 1 month later, when 2 guards came to the house to serve the fine on him, they learned that he had passed away a short time ago. The traditional understanding of religion, which eliminated the individual side of man for the sake of the interests of the social order, had no consolation to offer to Salim Effendi for the exhausting feeling of loneliness. In this regard, he probably preferred to follow the Sufi path, which was aimed at individual maturity, but which Sunni jurisprudence, aimed at the masses, discredited and humiliated. Undoubtedly, his personality, which was heavily weighted by his personal experiences, played a major role in this. The old man would later generalize this loneliness that characterized his father to his family members, his immediate circle, and then to society as a whole. We are alone, and we don't realize it. The mother's youthful dreams probably did not include her joining her life with a man of her father's age who had been married twice before. In any case, her childhood years of disappointments and hardships must not have allowed her to have rosy dreams about marriage. The hardships his father had caused the family as a deserter did not disappear or diminish when he was finally reunited with the family after overcoming the fear of being caught. In his black and white photographs, he had none of the vitality of a young girl. In his eyes, there was an anxious expression in anticipation of some unknown bad event that would overwhelm him with its overwhelming effect. And then, the old man thought that he had inherited from his mother the tendency to see in every event a structure that would end in sadness. His mother had come to this world to suffer. When she went from the city to the village as a bride, one of the stories she was told was about a bad incident that had happened to a young bride like her in the past. It was about a young bride who went to the toilet outside their house, fell into the pit of the toilet, and much later they found her body in the pit. This story, true or not, surely represented her fate. While living the historical destiny of the female gender, there were also initiatives in which the mother participated in life. In her later years, she dreamed of new dreams and realized them with her very limited means. Together with a close friend whom she dragged by the arm, she walked through the doors of the girls' vocational high school, completed tailoring courses, and became famous as the neighborhood tailor. With a broken-down sewing machine, a few spools of thread, and a pair of scissors, she began sewing clothes for everyone, and thus her hand found money, which gave her a little more freedom. The old man thought that he had never seen this initiative so clearly in his father, who educated 4 children and was in direct contact with society. He thought that one of the qualities he admired about his father was his motivation behind trying to make his mark with his photographs. The way he posed for the camera with his children in front of his shop was a meaningful challenge that seemed almost contrary to his life of humility. This photograph was proof that he was doing exactly what his culture demanded of him, that he was perfectly in tune with the values of the society in which he lived. He was sitting on a soda crate, and behind his shoulders were his older son and daughter, his younger brother on his knee, and the old man himself on the other side. This special photograph, in which the mother was not included, was a summary of Salim's life. The eldest brother resembled the, quote, rebellious youth in the hit movie of those years, West Side Story, with his coat in the fashion of the time, his hair combed backwards, and his arms held at his sides above his waist. The rebellious side that defined his identity had obviously allowed a fixed conviction to come to life, a deathly and murderous thought that would last for the rest of his life. The son of an authoritarian father would obey until he was in power. Rebellion, of course, had to wait until it could stand on its own 2 feet. It was at this point that the old man saw the influence of their father on him and his brother, a cautious side that did not respond immediately, that concealed itself. The influence of events pushed into the subconscious would persist to the end, unless they were dealt with through subtle psychological analysis. The old man admitted his disappointment, judging that the elder brother never had time for such analysis. His older brother was always right, and their parents could never be forgiven. The older brother's trauma was simply related to being given up for adoption. If the parents gave up their son, naturally, the son should have had the right to give them up. In several of the nostalgic photographs in the family album, the auntie and her husband were the oldest members of the relatives and had a role in the formation of the family. One of these photographs was taken in a garden on the occasion of an uncle's marriage. However, the focus was on the great-uncle and his wife, Auntie, with the bride and groom slightly behind. The great-uncle was noticeable with his large build, and the small child standing between his legs was the old man's sister. On his right and left were his wife and his wife's sister. Next to the cozy grandmother was the grandmother with the old man's chubby baby in her arms. At the other end was the big brother with his soldier's stance. In the back row was the father, the bride and groom with a bouquet of flowers in their hands, and the groom's only sibling, the mother. Although each of them had different inner worlds, what was reflected in the photograph was total seriousness. While the other photographs bear the traces of the hat revolution, the effects of which were still lingering in those years, in this photograph taken in the garden, everyone's heads were uncovered. The grandfather, a draft dodger, and his brother-in-law, the civilian officer of the military recruitment office, looked at the lens with their hands on their knees, but their expressions were different. While the severe psychological impact on the public of the serious measures taken against draft evaders, which were a major problem for the rulers until about 25 years ago, was still having a severe psychological impact on the public, The grandfather's eyes showed a nervousness of timid waiting, fearing that he might be caught at any moment, while the other one showed the self-confidence of a man who was aware that he was the representative of the law. The big brother-in-law wore a comfortable short-sleeved shirt with suspenders, while the others could not hide their thin build even with their jackets. The mustaches of the father-in-law, grandfather, and father were Hitler-like, reflecting the outdated fashion of those years. The father-in-law, who reflected the sullen, authoritarian civil servant type of the Republican era, and his wife, who reflected the Western type with her appearance, had an unquestionable dominance over this family of which they were the founders. Since they had no children of their own, when they asked the eldest of their 10-year-old siblings to run errands for them because they were getting old, the parents had no chance to say no to this order, in line with the codes of a culture of obedience. But a new life in a new city, after a long hours of traveling on a truck with all the stuff piled on top of it, was unacceptable for the adopted child. Unable to cope with the endless and incomprehensible whining, the child's stubbornness soon convinced his new parents that what they were doing was wrong, and he was able to return to the legless family. However, the parents had caused a lifelong trauma. The child's need for security, which he needed to overcome, was not met, and in a strange twist of events, this became an important factor in his success in life. Later in life, although he attributed his success in life only to his hard work, he would never admit that this trauma was the motivation behind his hard work. The equivalent of insecurity with his father would be a lack of love with his mother. This would manifest itself late in his life, to the point of his sadness at not finding the love he sought in his wife. He would always express the misfortune of being the first child on whom his parents learned how to raise a child, with the words, "Instead of being the first in the family, I should have been a fox on the mountain." In short, mother and father were unforgivable. Near the time of the mother's death, the only picture in her room was that of her first child. Although her daughter would occasionally say in conversation that the mother loved her brothers the most of all her children, the old man felt that it meant something more than love. Because of the trauma of childhood, his brothers had always made their mother feel that she and her father had abandoned her. The old man imagined that his mother must have experienced a similar trauma. He knew that the trauma of a deserter father who had caused the family hardship throughout his life must have had a negative impact on the young girl's upbringing, as she held a grudge until her death and could not forgive her father. The resemblance between her mother and her brother was surprising, as a twist of fate. With some delay, they met at the agreed place. The younger brother attributed the quality of the roads to the fact that they were able to come together at such a convenient time, even though they had traveled from 3 different cities in a country at least 500 kilometers apart. Then he concluded by saying that in recent years the country had made great strides in every field. Usually he did not speak for long. Once started, endless conversations were the trademark of the older brothers they had come to visit. Without delay, they took a car and set off for the eldest brother's summer house in the village. When they arrived, they immediately started reminiscing about the old days with shows of joy, hugs, and embraces. The conversation was lively, moving on to the next topic before it was over. Laughs and laughter every now and then. The years of coldness between sister and sister-in-law had disappeared, and the sweetness of the grandchildren was being talked about. Sister-in-law had spent hours preparing for the 15-minute meal. They took a souvenir photo at the dining table. Taking advantage of the fact that the elder brother had left the hall for a moment, the sister-in-law asked the brothers and sister how they had found him. The old man frowned but could not express his opinion. The older sister and the younger brother could only say that they, quote, thought he looked a bit old. A bit old. The sister-in-law didn't press the issue either. While they were drinking their coffee in the living room, a photograph that the old man had taken during his visit 10 years ago came to mind. This unfaded photograph was of an old couple holding hands walking on the beach. When looked at carefully, it was inevitable that this image would make one think. Seeing them like this after a lifetime of struggling to survive reminded the old man of the tendency he thought he had inherited from his mother, to see a structure that will end in sadness in every event. But no, his father had never held hands with his mother like this. The part that added meaning to the story was that the old man in this photo had a life partner who supported him so that he could stand on his feet. And this life partner had acted like a mother who had tolerated his occasional childish whining throughout his life, but who had also frequently scolded him. The childish obedience of their older brother, which did not go unnoticed, caused a pleasant feeling in his brothers and sister. They saw that he felt safe in the hands of his wife. His brother, who was scattered when he was alone and came to life in an extraordinary way when he was with his wife, was as if he was liberated from the feeling of insecurity that continued throughout his life, due to the trauma he experienced in his childhood with this surrender. The 2 good children and 3 grandchildren that he was proud of were the greatest joy of his old age. The pride of going to the Eid prayers with his sons was indescribable. He would get even more excited when he talked about his grandchildren. His eyes would sparkle. Even a simple gesture of those little children would become the most meaningful event of his life. Although the guests had come a long way, they did not stay long as they had agreed beforehand. All the insistence of the aunt and brother were fruitless. They would set out on their way back the next day, with the promise of repeating this visit from time to time.